Leximus stood up, and while with one hand she was wiping her cheek, she began to look at him with a threatening gaze and warned Lionel that despite being the prince, if he continued acting like this as her subordinate, she would be forced to take measures. Lionel gradually began to lose composure and couldn't help but become enraged, yet still remained silent. He started sweating like crazy, stared intently at her and with a mocking smile called her a parasite and asked what she was going to do about it. If she continued interfering in this, he was going to have her and all her relatives executed, with what she had said as the reason. He was going to completely erase her lineage and any trace of it. Upon hearing this, Leximus began to remove her hand from her face, and she couldn't help but panic and start feeling afraid. She knew this wasn't good. Before Lionel could continue with the threats, Princess Erin intervened and calmly ordered him to stop. It didn't take long for her to realize there was a reason why he had come to see her. Lionel started to observe her and couldn't help but start sweating. And with a confused look, he began to wonder what was happening and how she knew this. Princess Erin started to look at Lionel with a calm gaze and asked him if he wanted to hear something from her. Lionel panicked and was left speechless upon seeing that she was different from before, wondering if she was the same Erin Severus that he knew. She began to look at the ground and decided to tell him what he had come to hear. She placed both hands on her knees, and with a look full of confidence, told him that she, Erin Severus, had not received anything from him. Lionel's eyes filled with confusion and he started sweating like a maniac. He couldn't help but go on alert and be left speechless. A couple of hours ago, Princess Erin went to the king's office, who asked her if she was sure there was no relationship. Erin, who was sitting in front of him on the sofa, closed her eyes and answered affirmatively. The king began to look at her with an uncertain gaze and reminded her that the necklace she had brought him had a jewel which was not ordinary. He began to imagine the jewel surrounded by puppets. The jewel and the body of the puppets were surrounded by the same energy. It was a day's stone from the Black Blood tribe. It was used to dominate forbidden dark magic, although they were now despised. It was said that Day's stones were used to control monsters. He started to stare at her and revealed that there had recently been information that someone inside the palace had secretly bought this jewel. He began to imagine a maid and a merchant. He was the black market merchant named Gilbert, and she was the maid Merylda. They had been securing deals for some time, but both were missing or dead right now. Upon hearing this, Erin's eyes filled with confusion and she couldn't help but go into shock. With a calm look, the king revealed to her that those two used to be in contact with Lionel a lot. He asked her again if she really hadn't received anything from Lionel, questioning whether it was him who had given her the necklace. She started touching her fingernails and with a trembling voice denied this, adding that she had never received anything from Lionel. The king began observing her with a calm look and remained thinking silently. She started looking at the ground with a lost gaze and upon seeing that he had discovered who had brought those jewels to the palace, thought that Luna should no longer be suspicious, so she asked him to please let her go since she had saved many people at the banquet. The king, who was sitting on the sofa, crossed his arms and asked her not to worry about this. She raised her head and began to look at her father. If she told him that Lionel was involved in this incident, she would not be able to predict what the bastard Lionel might do to the people around her. She began to remember how the captain had been killed by the mandrake plant. She could not allow something like this to happen again. She needed to make sure they were prevented from getting hurt in the future. Back in the present, she started staring at Lionel and asked if this was what he wanted. He stood up, put a hand inside his pants pocket, and while his body was emitting a suffocating energy, he started to look at the ground and responded with a yes, adding that he had never given her anything. Princess Erin remained calm and told him that this was what she had told the king. Lionel began to stare at her with a gaze full of rage and couldn't help but start getting angry. He didn't know why she had this attitude or why she was acting as if he had done something wrong. He approached her and asked if he should do something first with that subordinate of hers. Princess Erin, who had both hands on her knees, closed her eyes and apologized to him, revealing that she had a guest now. Hearing this, he couldn't help but remain somewhat confused and with a puzzled look asked her who could be more important than him. She raised her head and with a serene look told him that he was important to her too. Behind them was Cyan, who had his arms crossed and his back leaning against the pillar. He started to look at the ground and apologized to Lionel, adding that he did not want to bother. Upon hearing Cyan's voice, Lionel went into shock and began to sweat. He had not felt Cyan's presence at all and did not know what he was doing here. Cyan put his hands in his pants pockets, raised his head, and with a suffocating look revealed to Lionel that he had heard everything. Luinel's body began to tremble with fear, and he asked Cyan how long he had been hiding there. Cyan moved away from the pillar, started walking towards them and was somewhat confused. Then he began to point at himself with his thumb, started looking at him and told him that simply he didn't have much presence. The main trait of assassins was that they had no presence. Luinel clenched his teeth tightly and with a furious look began to wonder if this was a joke and if Cyan was pulling his leg, and how he had the audacity to speak like that in his presence. Cyan approached the sofa where Princess Erin was sitting, placed his hand on the arm of the sofa and asked him what he was going to do about it. Cyan's eyes began to shine and with a smile he mocked him, asking if he was going to do something about him too. Princess Erin, who was sitting on the sofa, began to observe Luinel with a serene look and she remained silent. Despite Luinel being very angry, he remained calm, began to observe Cyan and couldn't help but wonder if the rumors about their engagement were true. For him, it wouldn't be good to become an enemy of Cyan since after all, he was the son of his father's friend and what Ashel had told him was now bothering him. A few hours ago, while both were walking down the palace hallway, Luinel extended his hand to one side and revealed that he wanted to remove Erin from the throne. But he didn't know why Ashel wanted to get rid of his younger brother, adding that his father already trusted him a lot. Ashel, who was walking beside him, started looking at the ground and mentioned that Cyan made him nervous. Luinel began observing him and stayed listening in silence without interrupting. While Ashel's eyes were shining, with a serious look, he revealed that Cyan was hiding something very big, which made him very nervous. Cyan got behind Erin's sofa, placed both hands on the arms of the sofa and started to smile, and his body began to emit a powerful and intense energy. Now Luinel understood what Ashel meant. He didn't know what this unpleasant feeling of intimidation that Cyan was emitting was. He began to stare at Cyan with a confused look and remained silently thinking. He raised his hands indicating that he did not want to harm the princess, closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile, told her that he was just joking. Now that the misunderstanding had been cleared up, he decided to leave. He turned his back on them and started moving towards the door. Cyan began to look at him with a confused expression and was somewhat perplexed. Having Cyan so close, Princess Erin couldn't help but blush. Cyan began to imagine Luinel sitting on a throne atop thousands of skulls. According to him right now, the personality of Luinel Severus wasn't so bad, at least for someone who had been nicknamed the Mad Emperor. He was better now compared to himself in his past life. Once Luinel approached the door, the guard opened it. He turned his head to one side and apologized to Leximus. She started looking at him and asked him not to worry and also apologized to him for her rude actions. He turned his head towards Cyan, began staring at him intently and asked him to be careful from now on. Several seconds later, he left Princess Erin's room and the guards closed the door. Leximus, who was standing next to the door, sighed and felt relieved. She turned back and vented a little, thinking that Luinel was a piece of shit. She thanked Cyan. Princess Erin, who was sitting on the sofa, started looking at the floor and while blushing she also thanked him. Cyan, who had his hands on the sofa, started to look at Leximus and told her that he hadn't done much. Seeing that this was the attitude of the best swordswoman on the continent, he thought this was very interesting. According to him, Princess Erin had done most of the work. She turned back and while blushing like a tomato, denied this and told him it was all thanks to him. Cyan sat on the sofa next to her and placed both hands on his knees. Seeing that he had sat next to her, she leaned back a little and blushed even more. Cyan turned his head towards her and explained to her that his legs hurt from standing for too long and asked her if he was not allowed to sit on the sofa. She looked away, started looking at the floor, and began touching her strands of hair with her hands. Seeing this, Cyan couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. Leximus began to look at Cyan with a confused look and she couldn't help but think that he really was stupid. Cyan was surprised that she had been able to tell all this to the prince. He stood up, approached the door, grabbed the knob with one hand, slightly turned his head back, and now that they had made Luinel believe that the two of them were together, he wouldn't be able to do anything to her for a while. For now, he decided to leave. Princess Erin put her fists in front of her face and started blushing even more. With a forced smile, Leximus asked him to take care. Seeing that he had only done what he should have and left immediately, she couldn't help but think that he was an arrogant person. At the same time, Luinel met with Ashel. He forcefully placed his hand on the wall near Ashel, who had his arms crossed, and asked him how he was going to fix this. He brought his other hand close to his face, began to look at him with a gaze full of rage and clenched his teeth tightly. Ashel had said that his plan was perfect, but now those they wanted dead were all alive. Now he had lost the king's trust, which was very bad. With a serious look, Ashel started staring at him intently and remained silent. Lionel lost his composure, started looking at the ceiling with a desperate look and couldn't help feeling furious and start shouting. He was supposed to be the savior of the king, the savior of the damn Ushif Empire. At that moment, a man approached them and told them there had been a bit of success. Lionel, who had his hand on the wall, asked the man who he was. Ashel, who had his arms crossed and back against the wall, remained listening in silence. This man was none other than Boris Elhelm. He placed his hand on his chest, bowed his head, closed his eyes, and with a cheerful smile, greeted Prince Lionel. Lionel moved away from the wall, turned around and with an angry look asked Boris where he had been all this time. Boris approached them and with a calm voice explained that he had to fulfill an order from Ashel. He began to look at Boris with a serene gaze. He had heard that Emily had disappeared, so he asked him what the success was. Boris took out a bright mana crystal shaped like a pyramid, and with a smile mentioned that they had been underestimating the people around Princess Erin. Lionel put his hands on his hips and asked if he was saying that he should reflect on his mistakes. While Boris was holding the mana crystal in his hand, he replied no, since there was nothing for him to reflect on. He brought the mana crystal closer to them, and the energy it was emitting became more intense. This mana crystal had been used by the princess's friends during the battle. Most of this mana was ordinary. He brought his two hands close to the mana crystal, causing black fog to start emerging from within. In the blink of an eye, the black fog filled the entire room. Witnessing this, Lionel couldn't help but be in shock, while on the other hand, Ashel simply remained calm. Boris explained that this black fog was very rare, and it could be considered something very evil and ominous. The mana crystal began to emit even more black fog. He started to smile and revealed that this was the mana of the demonic sword. With a look full of excitement, he came to the conclusion that one of Princess Erin's friends possessed the taboo demonic sword. At the same time, someone prepared a giant centipede dish, accompanied with rice, which had an unpleasant appearance. Seeing this, Brian couldn't help but feel disappointed and somewhat confused. He had thought that this was supposed to be crab stew. He didn't know what the hell he was looking at right now. Cyan and Nana, who were also present, started eating as if nothing happened and didn't even flinch at this. Nana even began to enjoy the food. Next to Brian sat Emily. She rested her head on her hand, and seeing that Nana was really enjoying the food, she couldn't help but feel happy and asked her to eat more slowly. Brian began to look at her with a perplexed look and thought she was crazy. Then he looked at the plate and saw something moving. Witnessing this, his eyes filled with fear. While the others were eating, Cyan put both hands on the table and told them he was full. Emily was somewhat confused and advised him to eat a little more. He began to wipe his mouth using the cloth, closed his eyes and refused, since if he stayed here longer, Ashel might notice. Emily clenched her fist tightly, hit the table and cursed Ashel. Once Cyan finished wiping his mouth, he opened his eyes and explained to her that he had only come to see if she was okay. It wasn't certain that she would return yet, so he advised her to send Brian if she needed anything. Next to the house there was a tree in which a member of Mist was watching the area. Cyan had people watching the area, so this place was safer than any other right now. He stood up, turned his back to them, and started moving towards the door. Seeing that he was leaving, she panicked and asked him to come back. Cyan turned his head towards her and asked her not to worry and also to take care of herself. After saying this, he called Brian's attention. Brian picked up some centipede meat using the fork, and upon hearing his name, he turned around. Seeing this, Cyan quickly realized that this guy was going to die in this place, eating Emily's food. The rays of the sun began to hit against the wooden door of the house, and Cyan went outside. At that moment, someone next to him caught his attention by saying that he had a nice little family. This person was another member of Mist. Cyan turned slightly back and began to observe silently. This person was Sarika. She started staring at him and asked if he was going to explain now how he knew about the blood banquet and her fiance's death, everything he had done, as if he knew the future. Despite being in this situation, Cyan remained calm. He had to be careful with what he said, as depending on his words, she might consider him an enemy. While Sarika's eyes were shining, she asked him who he was. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.